so grateful to have this opportunity to share some ideas with you that have meant so very much to me in my life. Thank you for joining us this evening. And a heartfelt thank you to the members of First Church of Christ Scientist in Lancaster, California, who are sponsoring this talk this evening. A while ago, I was searching on the internet, and I came upon a home for sale that really caught my attention, and it got me to thinking about how we go about making change for the better in our lives. This home was a century home that had been beautifully redecorated and refurbished throughout. And I could see that as I clicked through and looked at the photographs of the home. But suddenly this one photograph kind of surprised me because it didn't seem to fit with the rest of the house. The ceiling and the floor was too close together, and there hadn't been any redecorating done in this room at all. Well, that inspired me to look down in the advertising copy. And there in the advertising copy, it pointed out that the home had a structural issue. Apparently, when they were redecorating, they decided to take out a wall, but it wasn't properly reinforced. So one side of the house was sagging dangerously. Well, you know, so often when we go about making change for the better in our lives, we kind of start out like those homeowners. We start out with the surface level issues, the redecorating, you might say. We might do things like buy a new wardrobe or start studying a language that we hope to learn. There's many things. Maybe we start taking, paying more attention to exercise and things like that. None of those things are wrong. They're all good things. But if we want to make change for the better, real substantive change that really brings out our capabilities, change that expands our sense of security, change that improves our health and happiness, well, we need to get down to the structural issues. Because just like that house isn't going to be worth anything to anyone until someone comes along and addresses those structural issues. Once those structural issues are corrected, then someone will be able to enjoy that beautiful home. So this is what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be looking at 4 big ideas that help us to address the structural issues in our life and make a wonderful platform for making substantive change in our lives, change that really restores our sense of security and expands our lives. The first big idea that we'll talk about is what kind of a foundation our lives are built on. And the second big idea we'll talk about is how our connection to that foundation can never be severed. The third big idea that we'll talk about today is the stuff that we're made of and why that matters. And the fourth big idea we'll talk about is how we can prove the powerlessness of anything that would try to harm us. While we don't have a physical foundation like a building does, when we discover where we come from and the power that is upholding goodness in our lives, this provides us with a solid foundation on which we can make substantial positive change. I'd like to share with you a story of how I became more aware of what kind of foundation we have. My mother-in-law gave me this magazine, the Christian Science Sentinel, and as I started paging through it, I found that the articles in the magazine were written by people just like we are. People who are just everyday people who are applying the ideas of Christian Science to their lives. And the articles talk about healings that they've had and progress that they've had in their life. Well, that day that my mother-in-law gave me the Christian Science Sentinel, I found an article in that magazine that was about a woman who had difficulties with food and how she prayed about this. Well, that article caught my attention that day because when I was 10 years old, I had a allergy that was discovered, and the doctor diagnosed the allergy as an allergy to chocolate. Well, I sure wasn't happy about that, needless to say, and his solution for the allergy to chocolate that he had at that time was don't eat chocolate. That was the solution, which was not a happy solution, but I had no choice in the matter. Well, I thought I would read that article and see if it could help me with that allergy in any way. The thing that was most interesting to me is as I started to read, the article was talking about the nature of God. And it explained that God was the source of our being, that God was the foundation that our lives are built on, that we come from God. But even more wonderful than that God is all good, only good, all the time, under all circumstances, for all people. Well, I thought that was really something. That was a new idea to me. My concept of God had kind of been that God was a big man in the sky who was sometimes good and sometimes not so good. So this idea that I came from an all-good source was really quite meaningful to me. It really went deep into my understanding of who I was and started to change things in a very positive way. Because I realized that if I come from an all-good God, and we all do, the Bible gives us that information. And because we come from an all-good God, that means that we're good. That means that we have good prospects. That means that we are able to do the good that we want to do in our hearts. Well, this was a wonderful inspiration to me. And the ideas that are in these Sentinel articles come from this book, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures by Mary Baker Eddy. And they also come from the Bible. And we'll be talking about both of these books throughout the talk today and what they teach us. It's kind of interesting. This book, Science and Health, tells us how the Bible is relevant to our lives today. Well, I continued to read the article, and I was quite thrilled that I had discovered that first idea I mentioned I was going to talk about, the first big idea, that God is all good and all powerful, the only power, and that this is the foundation that our lives are built on. But the article went on to talk about food, and it explained that God, who is all good, could not create anything that would be harmful to the rest of his creation. That the food that was created, was not in conflict with all of us who need to eat food. That the two have to go together because God is an all-good creator. Well, that was the end of the article. And as I put it aside, I thought, how wonderful that was and how logical that was to me. That made a lot of sense to me, that a creation would be proceeding from the nature of its origin, from the nature of God, the Creator. Very interesting thing happened. Later that very same day, someone offered me a little box of chocolate. And I normally would have turned it down and said, no, thank you. But I looked at that box of chocolate and it was different than it had been to me than it would have been to me previously. Because I thought, now that article explained the pure, perfect goodness of God that is universal power. And it explained how I was a part of that same creation and that I could only be good and that I could only experience good and that food could only be good. It could only have a positive effect on folks. So I did something different that day. I accepted the box of chocolate. I said, thank you so much. And then I proceeded to eat it all. It was a little box. It was one very decorative little thing. Only had 4 pieces in it, but I did eat it. And the wonderful thing is I had no allergic reaction to that chocolate that day. And for the sake of science, I have tested that out over the years since that time, continuing to have chocolate. And I have never had any allergic reaction to chocolate since that time. Well, this was, of course, a fun change in my life. But it was really more than that, because that idea that I learned about my foundation really changed my life from there forward. Realizing that I came from an all-good source and that there was almighty power upholding goodness in my life and in everyone's life was tremendous. I actually even became physically stronger knowing this idea. And this is a universal truth. It's true for everyone. Not just for me, but for everyone. Now, some people might say that you can outgrow an allergy, but I want to go a little deeper into some of the ideas that I've already shared and explain to you what I think happened and how I know that this was not any coincidence, but a real solid healing. You know, today, many people are on a spiritual search. And by that they mean they're looking for something dependable, something reliable, something, that can anchor them. And for me, I found the answer to that spiritual search in the Bible. The Bible says that God is spirit. And so for me, everything is spiritual that proceeds from God, from this all-good source. Well, an interesting thing in the Bible, in the opening verse of the Bible, it says, in the beginning, God, and then it goes on to talk about everything that God created for the next couple of pages there. In the beginning, God. The thing that struck me about that little phrase was the word beginning, and I just want to talk about that for a minute. The word beginning can mean a certain point in time, but I realized that it also means the source or the origin of a thing. And interestingly, in the Spanish and Latin translations of the Bible, that word beginning is translated as principio, which means an origin or a source or a principle of a thing. And in English, the word principle is the origin or the source or the basis from which something proceeds. Well, thinking about this word beginning and the idea of it being the principle of existence, has made, for me at least, has made me to realize that the Bible is not talking about a person here. It's not describing God as a person, but as a governing principle, as the source of all things, the creator of everything that really exists, and the lawgiver that upholds that goodness and that power in its creation. And this is wonderful to know. This is the foundation of your being. This is where you come from. You come from God. God created you to be a part of his infinite goodness. And he upholds that goodness in you and empowers it day in and day out. When you think of it, we can't really know who we are unless we know who God is, who our foundation is, where we come from. But when we are coming to know the goodness of God, we are discovering our true being, our goodness, the power behind our lives. And what is so wonderful about this is that it is universal. There's no one left out of this. No one is closed out from this goodness. It is inherent. It's innate. It's who we are. And that's a joyful thing to know and a powerful thing to experience and to strive to understand more about in your life. Now, that first chapter in the Bible that I talked about is wonderful in that it explains the creation, and it explains the goodness of the creation, and it talks about people in there, and it says that we've been given dominion and the power to succeed, to be good and to do good. And that is solid information that we can bank on. The next chapter in the Bible has a different view. It gives a little bit of a different view. The first chapter gives us the spiritual view of creation, the pure truth of God and what God has created. The second chapter shows us how, if we lose track of that spiritual creation, that we might start believing in things like failure or sickness. And it is giving us an object lesson to show us what is really important and valuable in life, to keep that spiritual perspective on our living and experience. That second chapter is kind of pretty typical of how most people think about things today. It's the way that I thought about life before I read that article in the Sentinel and started to explore Christian Science. I thought that life was kind of a tug of war between goodness and badness or evil, and that we were in the middle and we were getting pulled one way and pulled the other, and we didn't have much choice in the matter. A lot of people in the world, even if they're not students of the Bible, consider things to be kind of like that existence is a mixture of good and evil, that there are have and have-nots, that some people have good genes and other people have bad genes that are going to doom them to disease in their life. Kind of like everything is arbitrary or left up to chance. But when you consider the spiritual nature of being is expressed in that first chapter in the Bible, and you may even think about that in connection with Jesus' life, which we'll talk about Jesus in a few minutes, you start to see that there are other possibilities. You could think of your spiritual practice as something that helps you get through the ups and downs of life with a hope that eventually in the afterlife you'll get someplace, maybe call it heaven, and there you'll experience the pure goodness of God. Or one spiritual practice could have a different purpose. That purpose being to help us to apply the facts, the spiritual facts of our connection to God, our oneness with God, to our daily living, and to prove the all power of goodness, and to prove our connection with God, everyone's connection with God. This is a wonderful opportunity. And you might think of that healing that I had of the allergy to chocolate came in just that way. When I read those ideas, well, they were so wonderful, I just soaked them in. And they changed my thought and lifted me out of my false sense of being as kind of doomed to never be able to enjoy chocolate, to a real understanding of my permanent and forever wholeness. So they helped me to prove this fact, though I wasn't at that moment intentionally trying to prove something. The ideas were so wonderful, they just lifted me right into having that proof and discovering a deeper sense of my spiritual being and the power of God in my life, which has been so very valuable to me. And I've known many, many people who have discovered these same ideas and have had tremendous change take place in their lives. Goodness, great stability, and much progress, restoration of their health come into their lives by taking a hold of these ideas. And then they see that they have proved them in their life. Now you might wonder, how can I get these kind of ideas to help me in my individual life? Well, we can look at spiritual source books like the Bible and Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. Also, the Sentinel is still available for you to look into. And we can read these wonderful books and discover new things about ourselves and our fellow man. We can find these true statements of what reality is in those books and embrace those in our thought and put them to work in our lives. Someone told me once a good way to read Science and Health is to read it until there's something that really strikes you, something that you can understand or that you think is interesting, and then take it and apply it to your life. Use it in your daily life. So this kind of study of these spiritual source books is a kind of prayer. Prayer isn't only about reciting set words. It really has a rather deep sense of learning more about God, getting a deeper, clearer understanding of your own spiritual being and of the world in which we live. And these ideas do bring healing. And prayer is something, that you can do anywhere at any time. And it takes many forms. Sometimes we just quietly listen. Other times we're actively seeking ideas. Sometimes we're contemplating those ideas and seeing how they apply to our lives at the moment. But it is a wonderful way to feel the power of God in your life and to progress, to see good change taking place. Well, I would like to share another healing that I experienced, which taught me about big idea number 2, that we can never be separated from our foundation, that our connection with God is indestructible. I became ill to the extent that I pretty much couldn't do anything but stay in bed for several days. And I was praying, seeking a clearer understanding of my spiritual being, seeking to learn more about God and the love of God. And my family was praying, and I also had a friend that I had called on to pray along with me during this time. I appreciated the prayers and the ideas that were coming to me as I prayed. They did bring me comfort, and I wasn't afraid in this situation because I had depended upon prayer for physical healing for many years by that time. And I had proved it and the power of it over time. So I was sure there would be healing. The study, helped to hold me up and guide me along the way. But before I had become ill, I had had a career derailment. Some people that were working with me lied about me. And the lies that they told were so destructive that it put an immediate end to the work that I had been doing, which I really loved and I thought was a part of my long-term career goal. In fact, this was such a distressing situation to me that I was tempted to believe that good versus evil sense of things that is so common that I talked about, that in that particular case, that evil had won. Well, the falsehood of that statement didn't occur to me for a while. As I continued to pray, after about 7 days, I really hadn't felt any physical improvement. And I was really reaching out to God with all my heart and really doing all that I could to soak in the ideas that were coming to me and being shared with me from my family and friends. But this one day, as I was quietly praying on my own, a thought came to me that was a very powerful thought. And that thought was that even though unethical people had told lies that put an end to my career as I knew it at that point, that God had never stopped unfolding his goodness and upholding his goodness in my life. Well, as I thought about that, I thought, well, that is absolutely true. And I wondered, how could I have gotten lured into believing that evil had won? I could see from that thought that God has never stopped upholding goodness in my life, that evil hadn't won, that evil could never win, that God is the only power, and that goodness is the only power at work in my life. Well, this was just a tremendous relief to me. It was a mental relief, to be sure, because I immediately grew a conviction that even though I didn't know what was going to happen next in my career, something good would happen, because I hadn't been separated from God. You might say that thought that evil could have won, was presenting the false idea that I was separated from God. But when this truth came to me, you might call it a Christ idea, came to me, I could see the falsity of the idea that evil could win, and the true power that I was safe and that only goodness was at work in my life. And that I didn't even need to know exactly how it was going to be appearing in my life, but that I was convinced that it was going to be appearing. Well, immediately, the physical symptoms that were keeping me in bed started to dissipate. And I was able to get out of bed that evening. And in a very short time, I was completely free of all of the physical problems that I was having at that time, and totally well, and have been in that regard ever since. You see, we can't be severed from God, separated from God, because God is love. And God always loves. That is the nature of God, to always love us. So I may feel or think at some point that I'm separated from that, but it's never going to be true, because there's never going to be a moment or a millisecond when God is not completely loving you, loving me, loving all. That is the nature of God. And so, no matter what we do or what we've done, that can't stop God from loving us. It never will. And that's our connection to God. It's what God is doing. So we're always safe. We're always cared for. And we're always loved. And as we perceive more and more of that, we find solid healing and progress in our lives. I went forward from that moment in time when the physical healing took place, and during the next year, a new job became available to me that was better than the one I had, and it offered some wonderful things. It offered progress and growth, and it was along the lines of my interests, so it was a very good job. And it also brought me into contact with many new people. And these new people that I met, a number of them became very close friends of mine. And because of their professional lives, brought really interesting, very rich dimensions to my life that hadn't been there before. And that makes sense, because I had perceived more of the reality of God's goodness at work in my life. And it was just natural then for me to experience more of the reality of God's goodness. It was always there, but I was discovering it and experiencing it in a broader sense. And I have seen this happen in many other people's lives as they have taken up the study of Christian Science to find out what is their foundation and what is their connection to that foundation, and how perfect it is when they discover that. And this is free for everyone to discover. This is reality, is what we're learning here. And reality is good. Reality is God, the principle that governs all things, and his ideas, his children, his people, his whole creation is inherently good and capable. And it's a wonder to discover this along the way. Well, Christian Science was discovered by Mary Baker Eddy. And I'll tell you more about her in a few minutes. And what she discovered was the laws of God and their upholding of goodness in the world, the power of God at work in the world. In her book, she explains it this way. She says, talking about her discovery, she says it was the final revelation of the absolute divine principle of scientific mental healing. The revelation of scientific mental healing. The Christian part of Christian Science comes from the life of Christ Jesus that is explained in the New Testament of the Bible. And, you know, even if you're not familiar with that, that's entirely okay. I think you'll find a little great value, really, in how what Christ Jesus was doing through his healing work connects with what I've been talking about. Christ Jesus gave us a unique window into the nature of God through his own goodness, the goodness that was conveyed in his selfless living. We see the loving nature of God and the healings that he did in his life show the present power of God, God with us. And that power, in effect, many refer to Jesus or Christ Jesus, using the name Christ. It's kind of like a title for Jesus. And what it shows is the unique way in which he proved the power of God to care for us right here where we are. Even though Jesus isn't physically with us today, he showed us this activity of the Christ. One way you can look at it is like that Christ idea that came to me about God's goodness always being in effect in my life. And the Christ ideas from God speak to us in a way that meets our individual need. You know, we don't have to know any particular this or that or the other thing, because God knows you. God knows us. And so God knows what we need and communicates these Christ ideas. And this goes on today and always. Jesus was showing us the way. He was showing us God's power in our lives and God's love for all of us. And one thing I love about everything that you read about Jesus in the New Testament, it shows that he didn't think that anyone ever had a reason to not have hope. He knew that there was always a reason to hope because of the goodness and the allness of God that is at work in everyone's life without fail. Well, I'd like to talk about big idea number 3 now, which is the stuff we're made of and why that matters. Well, as you can see from these 2 healings that I shared, that the thing that changed was my thought, right? My understanding of what kind of a foundation I was built on, my understanding of my connection to God that can never be severed. My growing understanding of the all power of goodness and the no power of evil. These changed my thought, and the result was of physical restoration. It was kind of like I was waking up to who I already was, because we are 100% spiritual. We are 100% what God, who created us, knows about us. And God, who is pure goodness, only knows goodness. So we're 100% what God knows about us. Spiritual. And that's why a change in our thought, a realization, or a clearer perception of what God is doing in us and of who we are as His creation, changes our actual physical being and expands our life in many different ways. Well, you might say that's a pretty radical idea. And it can seem like that in our world today, where physical healing is largely approached through material means, by trying to have some effect on the matter of our being. But as our thought changes and we perceive more clearly the true nature of reality, then we experience that 100% good being that God has created. Mary Baker Eddy discovered this idea through the love of God and through her life experiences. She had I want to pick up her history just briefly here, at a point where she was a young woman, but she was a widow, and she had a young child. She had not discovered Christian Science at this point. She had always loved God. She'd always been close to the Bible and studied the Bible all through her life and relied on it for comfort and guidance. But she hadn't yet made her discovery of Christian Science when she wrote this note to her sister. She said, "I am weary, working my way through life from the middle to the end. I want to learn to play on a piano so that I can go south and teach. 'Tis all I shall ever be able to do," she said. Well, she was in poor health at that time, and after she wrote that to her sister, she continued to experience poor health, and she went to different treatments that were available at her time to see if she could find the health that she was hoping for. But none of the different variety of treatments that she tried helped her. Well, she continued to hope for good in her life, and she eventually remarried. But a while after she remarried, she discovered that her husband was unfaithful. So this was another difficult challenge in her life. Well, she kept turning to her Bible just as she always had, and she would always find comfort there and guidance and hope for the future. But things really didn't look better for years upon years. Well, she came to a crisis in her life after she was involved in an accident. And she wasn't able to get up and walk. Well, she asked for her Bible at this time, and she opened the Bible to one of Jesus's healings. And as she read that healing, she saw something there that she hadn't perceived before. You might say she felt the touch of the Christ coming to her thinking. And she got the first light of the idea that we're 100% spiritual, and that was what Jesus was showing us through his healings, the healing work that he did that's recorded in the Bible. Well, this was so vibrant to her and so significant to her that she immediately got out of bed and was able to stand on her own feet and dress herself and go forward with her life. Well, to Eddy, this was very wonderful. She was, of course, grateful to be healed from what she had suffered physically from this accident. But such a magnificent impact on her body. So she devoted the next 3 years to study the Bible and to search for ideas, to search for a connection between what she experienced and what the Bible was teaching. And she did find many connections, to the extent that she started healing other people. During these early years of her discovery, she healed a man with an advanced problem of pneumonia. She healed a little boy who was suffering from a deformity, and she healed a man who was deaf, restored his hearing. She wanted to know if she could teach other people how to do this. And she could see the value of what she had discovered. So she devoted the rest of her time to teaching, explaining, and healing. 35 years after she had made the discovery, she started this magazine, The Sentinel, and another magazine called the Christian Science Journal. This magazine is printed every week. It's published every week. The journal is printed once a month. She wrote this book, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, that explains the healing discovery that she made, and actually has 100 pages in the back of testimonies, verified testimonies from people who had, it's a chapter called Fruitage, from people who were healed by reading the book and thinking about the ideas that they find in the book. She gave talks. She started a church. She just did everything that she was inspired to do to make this discovery available to mankind. And it is still available today for all of us to use and to learn and to embrace. But you know, there's one thing that Mary Baker Eddy didn't do. She never learned to play on the piano. But that's totally forgiven, because what she did do has changed the world for the better. I want to bring up big idea number 4 here before we close, and I want to read what Eddy says about that here in her book, Science and Health. She says, "We must learn that evil is the awful deception and unreality of existence. Evil is not supreme. Good is not helpless, she goes on. We must learn that evil is the awful deception and unreality of existence. I have to be honest, that, to me in the beginning seemed like a pretty big step to realize the unreality of evil. And in our world today, there's lots of evidence of evil. It seems to appear in many different varieties. But it makes sense that if our motivation, if our object is to prove the goodness of God and the all power of God, who is all good, we really can't at the same time entertain the idea that evil is powerful and could even be more powerful than God. So it's taken me some time to work through this, and I imagine that there's still probably things up ahead that I'm going to learn. But I just want to share a little bit about my process in accepting that idea and seeing the value of it. If you think about it, the only things behind evil are fear and ignorance. You think about, what is motivating evil? Why would anyone do something evil? Fear and ignorance. Those are not powerful stances. There's nothing of God behind evil. God, supreme and all-powerful goodness, just obliterates evil. It's like the brighter light that gets rid of the shadow. Evil can't exist together with God, because God is all in all there is. But what we see of evil, we can begin to understand the powerlessness of it. There's not some great evil power upholding evil. No. The great and only power is goodness, and that is upheld. That is upheld with infinite power. To get rid of evil in the world, for all of us to do our part, we start with our own thinking. And I don't mean that we start with human will. I used to think that way. I would hope every day when I would get up that I was going to do right, be good, improve on whatever I was struggling with at the time. By, human will, through my own wits. That was, it was my desire. But, it never worked for me. And I know many other people that hasn't worked for. Because we need to tap into that foundation that we have, the spiritual foundation. And our spiritual foundation, our relationship with God, tells us that we are good, that we're not trying to be. We are good now, at this time. And we only know good, and we only want to do good. And now this is a great way to kind of root any little nasty evils that might want to lurk around in our thinking. Whether it might be today with all of the political upheaval all around the whole world. In fact, we're being told, that there's this bad guy and there's that bad guy. But we want to watch in our thinking, not to build up a bad guy, but to knock down a bad guy, reduce it to, its only elements, fear and ignorance, whatever kind of bad guy is presented. God makes good guys, makes all of us good. And good has the power behind it. Evil is powerless. Just like when I had that healing after the people had lied about me, the thought that came to me showed me that evil had not won, and that evil was not power, and that God had not stopped doing what God is always doing in all of our lives, upholding and empowering goodness. So day by day, as we think about these things in our quiet prayers, we start to root out any little evils that might be lurking. You know, maybe their dislike of someone, or jealousy, or our judgment of someone. They get rooted out by the true sense of reality, the true sense of God's power. Well, I had an experience that helped me to move ahead a little bit more with this putting down of evil in the world and in my own thinking, which is where we put it down, is in our thinking. One night it was pretty deep in the night, probably about 2 o'clock in the morning, I was suddenly kind of shaken awake, and I thought, oh, why am I awake? Well, I realized there had been some kind of a loud noise in the neighborhood. And I thought, oh, I wonder what that was. I wonder if someone is breaking into something. Well, I felt to stay still and to listen and pray. And I didn't hear any more noises. I didn't hear any more sounds or any kind of ruckus going on in the neighborhood. So as I prayed, I thought about first, that my security and the security of everyone in my home, that God, who is a principle that always governs, was governing everything in my home, and that God, the principle of all being that is infinite, was present everywhere, in every room of my house, outside of my home, and filling the whole neighborhood. That the divine principle, God, infinite good, was present everywhere and governing as God does, upholding his laws of goodness as God does. Well, this brought me a great deal of peace. But then the thought occurred to me, well, what are you doing talking about a thief? Do you think that God made someone to be a thief? And I thought, oh, no, that wasn't right, was it? God didn't make anyone to be a thief. God made everyone to be good, to do good, to feel satisfaction, and to have a constructive purpose. He wouldn't have made anyone to feel a lack, or to get the crazy idea that they could somehow benefit by taking something from someone else. So I was grateful to have been corrected and to think more clearly about the fact that God is not the creator of thieves, that God is creator of good men and women and children and everyone in between. Well, this brought me, again, a good amount of peace. It helped me to really reconnect with that truth that we are spiritual, and that the creation is spiritual, and that it's governed by an all-good, all-powerful God. And I hadn't heard any other noises, so I thought, I'm going to go back to sleep. And as I started to doze off, though, a question came very strong into my thought. And that question was, how do those prayers do any good if someone has already stolen something. And I thought, oh boy, I'd really like to go to sleep. But it demanded an answer. And I didn't have an answer for that. But I just reached out to God, opened by thought, quieted noisy thoughts, and just listened for a spiritual idea. And the idea that came to me was really, truly beautiful and meaningful and helpful to me. The idea that came to me was that even if someone made a mistake and stole something, God would be doing what God does, continuing to urge goodness, continuing to encourage goodness in that person, continuing to point them in the right direction. This was wonderful to me because sometimes when I had made mistakes in the past, I had really felt like that kind of cut me off from good. And here I was seeing that God wouldn't cut me off. He wouldn't cut anyone off because it wouldn't be in the nature of God to do that. That God would be urging and inspiring and pointing the way in our consciousness to do the right thing. Well, I just love this because it also made me realize that the love of God is bigger than I had thought of it as before that. It made me realize that the love of God is so pure, and it's constant. As the Bible says, God's eyes are too pure to behold evil, because God only knows the reality that God created, which is good. And so God is always urging that good on the consciousness of all mankind, of all people. God is urging us to know what's right and to do what's right. Well, this thought was so big to me, and it touched me so deeply that I went on to sleep at that point, kind of in a glow. I felt like I was just feeling a glow of love that I hadn't perceived before, love that was universal, that was for everyone, that filled my neighborhood and touched everyone in it. Well, in the morning, I'd kind of forgotten about these things, but when I went out of my home, one of the neighbors waved me down, and she was very animated. And she wanted to know if I had heard about what had taken place in the neighborhood the night before. And I remembered the noise, but I said, well, no, what happened? And she said, well, someone broke into the garage next to our home. And I said, oh, dear, I'm so sorry, because I was, thinking about what I had heard and the prayers. And she said, oh, no, that's not the end of the story. And I said, oh, really? What happened? She said, well, they took several items, but every item that was taken from the garage was found 3 houses down the street, just placed on the lawn, just everything left there, not a single item missing. I felt that love again, just coming back, very powerful. And it made me ponder how our prayers actually go out and reach out beyond our own individual experience. I was praying for my safety, the safety of my home, etc. But my prayers took me farther than I would have ever imagined, for one thing. And they had clearly changed the direction of whoever it was who had taken those items. That person had clearly felt that power of God that I was discovering at work in their life. And they put the items there and left them, didn't steal them. They had a change of thought, didn't they? And what I discovered in thinking about how could, that my prayer in my bedroom, reach out and seem to have such a clear impact. And I realized that when we pray, we're like a person who is in a dark room with a group of people, and they go and they open up the shade, or pull it up, or however the shade opens. And the sunlight comes in. Well, the sunlight doesn't just come in on the person who opens the shade. The sunlight comes in on everyone in the room. And so when we pray, we may like to pray when we walk or when we're sitting in our favorite chair, however you like to pray, wherever. We're like that person opening that shade. And we can expect that our prayers are going out, and the inspirations that come to us, the Christ ideas that come to us in our prayers, touch others. They reach out and they touch others. And this incident proves, that big idea number 4, that we can prove the powerlessness of anything that would try to shake or harm us. And we can prove that same powerlessness for the world at large. There's so many things today in the world that try to present themselves as something that could shake or harm us. But as we identify the goodness of the creation, the goodness of us all, we learn more about the nature of God and about love, and that thought goes out into the world and does reach other people and does have a healing, positive effect on world affairs. So we have, the ability to change our lives for the better and to change the world for the better, building on this firm foundation that God is the source of our being and God is all good, and knowing that we can never be separated from God because God will never stop pouring out his love for us. And that all the world is 100% spiritual. All people are spiritual. One with God, originating with God, and feeling the power of God in their lives. And evil is the unreality. We can prove these things, and it's a wonderful joy to do that. And it's a wonderful joy to have had the opportunity to share these ideas with all of you this evening. Very grateful that you joined us, and I know you're looking to join in this wonderful, rich activity of changing the world for the better. I want to mention here before I say goodbye that the First Church of Christ Scientist in Lancaster, California, which sponsored my talk this evening, invites you to attend their church services on Sundays at 10:30 and on Wednesdays at 7 p.m. And you're also invited to visit their reading room or any Christian Science reading room worldwide, where you can purchase this book and other spiritual books, the Bible reference books, and you can also just enjoy the reading room to study and to pray. After I say goodbye, there'll be a slide that'll come up that'll give the address of their church and the reading room, so you can take a look at that. Well, just thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm really so grateful to have had this opportunity and have enjoyed this time together. Many thanks. Bye-bye.